Hi. So, as promised, I want to get back to the topic of apology in season three. I want to talk about the sort of cluster of topics of apology, responsibility, repentance, and how these things all fit together. We talked about apology a fair amount in earlier seasons because we saw at least one important apology. We saw, or failed apology, you might think we saw Bojack apologizing to Herb. In season three, we get at least two rounds of important apologies that need discussing. One we've already brought up because it comes up in the underwater episode, and that's his attempt to apologize to Kelsey. And then later in the show, in the season, pardon me, in episode 11, we get what can only be described as an apology bender, right? Where he and Sarah Lynn travel across the country so that he can try to apologize to everyone he thinks he's ever harmed. And we have a whole series of apologies. Again, all of these are arguably failed apologies, but we'll get back to that. As I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, Bojack's apology to Kelsey has one obvious big problem, even though it seems to be otherwise a textbook good apology, and that is that she doesn't hear it, she never gets it, and she doesn't read the note. So this raises some important questions. One is the philosophical question, what makes something a good apology? We've sort of danced around this, but we haven't taken it on directly. How do we distinguish a good, successful apology from an unsuccessful apology? And then a more specific question within that is, can something be a good apology even if it's never heard or received? The third question we've already kind of answered, namely, can something be a good apology even if it doesn't get forgiveness? And I think that we saw that the answer to that is yes, that if somebody is apologizing just in order to extract or demand forgiveness from the victim, then that really isn't a good apology because it makes the apology be about the wrongdoer and the wrongdoer's own redemption rather than being about the victim and healing and restitution for the victim, which is what it should be. So any apology that demands forgiveness is a bad apology, even though forgiveness might be freely offered. But when he apologizes to Kelsey, he doesn't demand forgiveness. So in that sense, it is a good apology. That's not the problem with the apology. So can an apology be a good one even if no one hears it? Well, notice that if you think that apology is about the mental state of the apologizer, if you think that it's about feeling sorry on the inside and understanding what you did wrong or feeling guilty, then in some sense it wouldn't really matter if the other person heard the apology or not, right? As long as you had the right contrite mental state. So that's a clue for us that in fact that's not what apology is, right? Apology is not about having the right feelings of guiltiness or sorriness. It's about having the right impact on the victim. And in order to have the right impact on the victim, the victim has to receive the apology. It's not at all obvious, I think, what the benefit to victims of apology is. We have a strong intuition that apologies, when they're good, help victims. But since they may not undo the original harm or fix the original harm, and since they're different from restitution, right, from like making good on what you did, it's an interesting question how apology helps victims. But in any case, if apology should be about helping the victim, then it can't be just a mental state, and it can't be something that you do that is never heard. Okay, so what are the elements of a good apology? It seems like an apology, and I've given you a couple readings that talk about this in different ways, right? An apology seems to require, for one thing, the acknowledgement of the specific harm that was done. For another thing that's especially relevant for this season and our discussions here, it seems to require taking responsibility for the harm, right? It's not a good apology if you say, oh, I'm sorry I did this, I had to do it, or I was forced to do it, or I couldn't help myself. A good apology owns the original action and says, I am the one who did this harmful thing, and I'm the one who's accountable for it, and I take responsibility for it. It seems to require a commitment not to continue the harm. You can't always fix the harm done, but you at least have to commit to not doing that harm anymore. And finally, a good apology, well, sorry, let me add one more thing first. An apology, as we saw, doesn't demand forgiveness, so that's important, although it opens the possibility of forgiveness. But also, a good apology has to be second personal. It has to be something that you offer to the victim. You need to, in a good apology, you need to be able to say, not only I did harm and I'm accountable for that, but you were the one harmed and I am sorry to you. That offering of the apology is part of the help to the victim. Again, I think it's fuzzy and unclear what the victim gets out of that. But whatever the victim gets out of it, however it helps the victim to have the apology has to be directed in the right way. It has to be directed to the victim. And so an apology that doesn't meet its mark, does not acknowledge the victim directly and get heard and recognized by that victim, will not be a good apology. Okay, so Bojack does his very best to apologize to Kelsey. It seems to have all of the other elements of a good apology. It doesn't demand forgiveness. It specifies the harm done. It takes full responsibility for that harm, and it identifies the proper victim of that harm. It's kind of amazing that Bojack did that. But he has what we might call bad moral luck. Through no fault of his own, the apology still doesn't work because it's not heard. And I think that the show sets up an interesting tension for us here, right? We want to give Bojack moral credit for this apology. But in a sense, we can't. Because even though he did his best through no fault of his own, he really didn't succeed in apologizing. Remember, go back to Nietzsche here. Nietzsche says, what you do on the inside isn't what defines you. It's your actual acts that define you. So in this case, we want to say Bojack had good intentions, he really tried, but ultimately what morally defines him is what he did, his act. And sadly for him, his act failed, right? His act did not actually reach Kelsey. And that's one of the kind of tragedies of existentialism, is that you can fail to realize yourself as a moral being, fail to express the value that you want to express, sometimes through no fault of your own, just through bad luck. Now here's a really interesting fact about Kelsey's apology, or Bojack's apology to Kelsey. Bojack says, these are his words, "I'm sorry you got fired. I'm sorry I never called you afterwards." Notice that this is the exact apology that he owed to Herb Kazaz, right? He needed to apologize to Herb for exactly the same thing. This is Bojack's big chance for a do-over. It's not just another apology. It's the same apology, right? I'm sorry you got fired. I'm sorry I never called you afterwards. I'm sorry I abandoned you. This apology is better. He never did this with Herb. He never specified the harm. He never took responsibility for the harm. He never showed acknowledgement of exactly how his actions that belonged to him did harm to his victim. He also tried to force forgiveness out of Herb, and he's not trying to force forgiveness out of Kelsey, so it's better in that way too. So it's especially sad that his do-over fails through no fault of his own, because he really did get it right this time up until the fact that the apology was never heard. Now later in the season, we get an entirely different kind of apology, right? Altogether different from what he did for Herb or for Kelsey. This is when Bojack and Sarah Lynn go on a giant bender, and as part of Bojack's supposed 12-step program, he gets to the stage of making amends. And what he wants to do is cross the country and drunkenly apologize to everyone. So he tries to apologize to Todd and Anna Spanakopita and Penny and various other people. Why does he go on this apology bender? Well, in the episode before, Todd tells him, and it really hits him where it hurts. Todd says, "Look, Bojack, you can't just keep doing shitty things and feeling bad about it. You have to actually be a better person." In other words, this cycle of acting badly and then feeling bad on the inside is not useful, right? From an existentialist point of view, you have to actually do good things, not just feel bad about the bad things that you did. So he goes into this episode, episode 11, feeling really gut punched by what Todd said to him and feeling like his moral situation is hopeless. because he's already done these bad things, and feeling shitty about them isn't going to help. Sarah Lynn comes along and gives him a very different and ultimately much more damaging message, right? She says, no, 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 you can do whatever you want and get a clean slate. In effect, Todd is wrong. All you have to do is just make amends. So do whatever you want, make amends, and then your moral scorecard is clear and you're back to square one and everything is good. This is the exact opposite of the message that Todd gave him. And of course, the view of the show is that Todd's message is right and Sarah Lynn's message is wrong. But Sarah Lynn's message is much more hopeful and less depressing for Bojack. And so out of his sadness at what Todd told him, he takes it, right? So he goes on this making amends binge with her. But these are maximally terrible apologies that he gives. They're terrible in so many different ways. In fact, it's sort of like an interesting philosophical exploration of the various ways in which apologies can be terrible failures. And so sometimes, in one case, he apologizes to the wrong person. He apologizes to some random kid instead of to Todd. So of course the apology doesn't meet its mark. He apologizes without actually listening to the victim or the victims or what they have to say about what he did. Right? Anna Spanakopita tries to talk to him 3 times, and each time he completely spaces out and doesn't listen to her at all. Sometimes he blames the other person. In a couple of cases, and this is probably the biggest violation, right? In the case of Anna Spanakopita, and even more in Penny's case, he apologizes for his own personal reasons to get personal absolution, but he does so by intruding into a situation in a completely inconsiderate and even a traumatizing way, right? He wants to get in his apology so badly that he does so without any regard for his effect on his victim. And this is exactly the opposite of what an apology is supposed to be. An apology is not supposed to be to help the apologizer and give absolution to the apologizer. An apology is supposed to be restitution to the victim. And if you don't care if you're harming the victim by apologizing, and if you pay no attention to whether your apology is an intrusion, that's kind of a maximally bad apology. So, and also, to add in one more complicating factor, right? Most of the apologies he gives in this episode, he's blackout drunk or just finished being blackout drunk or high. So he quite literally doesn't ever remember why he's there, how he got there, why he's doing what he's doing. So talk about a failure of apology, right? He can't possibly take responsibility in his acts of apology, which is one of the key elements of apology. He can't take responsibility because he isn't responsible at that moment. He has no idea what he's doing. He's not acting out of any sense of self whatsoever. As a side point, I think this raises a really interesting philosophical question, not so much about apology, but about acting under the influence of drugs or alcohol to the point where you are blacking out. If you act when you are blackout drunk or have just finished being blackout drunk and you literally don't remember that you're acting or why you're acting, is kind of an interesting question about whether it's really you who's doing it at all, right? Who's performing these actions? If we want to say that having some sense of continuity and memory and self-reflection is part of what makes you a particular self that comes together and has some unity and personal identity, which most people want to say, then acting when you're blackout drunk or just after you're blackout drunk and you have no idea why you're there might seem to be not an action that comes out of that self at all, right? It has no integration with the rest of the self, and you're not able to have any sort of conscious sense of memory or integrity. So who's acting when you act blackout drunk? Is it you? Is it some other self that pops up? Or is it like an action that comes from no self at all? In any case, what kind of responsibility do you have for those acts? We don't want to let people off the hook for the terrible things that they do when they're blackout drunk. But on the other hand, it does seem that even though maybe you should be blameworthy for what you do when you're blackout drunk, you might be blameworthy but not responsible, right? It seems like you might be in a position where you quite literally can't take responsibility. So that's an interesting result if we need to separate blameworthiness from responsibility. And I think it's also interesting to think about the implications for our thoughts about personal identity of actions performed while or right after being blackout drunk. Anyway, back to apology. So here, this sort of, among other things, it's a sharp critique of the 12-step program, I think, right? The 12-step version of making amends, where you just go around and make amends according to a formula, and specifically, like the point of the making amends in the 12-step program is to help the harm doer with their own recovery rather than to help the victim. And you might think that that makes making amends in the 12-step sense a kind of a deep perversion of the point of apology to start with, right? Anyway, making amends in this formulaic way where you just go through the ritual of apology and it's just designed to help the apologizer and not the victim, I think shows up as a form of bad faith, using the concept of bad faith that I talked about in the last lecture. Right? It's actually a way of avoiding responsibility, not taking responsibility. It's a way of having a social formula and a social institution where you can say, okay, I'm just going to follow this formula and follow this institution, and then I don't have to grapple at all with what I did. I get a clean slate, and I don't have to think about what responsibility might actually require, right? Society tells me that if I'm an addict, I'm supposed to go through these 12 steps, I'm supposed to do this formula, and once I do it, then I don't have to take responsibility for anything anymore. So it's sort of classic bad faith. In fact, this making amends trip that they go on is pretty much the most irresponsible thing ever, right? Sarah Lynn says to him, hey, when you make amends, don't you just feel lighter? This is the opposite of the point of apology, right? Apology is not supposed to make you feel lighter. It's supposed to do the exact opposite. It's supposed to make you feel the gravity of what you did, among other things. It's not for the purpose of unburdening the one who harmed. And this version of responsibility that we get within their interpretation of the 12-step program says, hey, just do whatever you want as long as you make amends by saying sorry. That's the least responsible possible attitude. So I think that we've already seen 3 versions of responsibility show up in the context of this season, right? One is, we talked about this a lot in the last lecture, we saw the Sartrean story of responsibility as radical, unconditioned individual responsibility, right? Where you're responsible as long as you take complete, full responsibility for your actions and recognize that you are conditioned by nothing but your own choices. And under that Sartrean radical individualist version, you almost wouldn't ever need to apologize, right? Because we don't owe anybody anything in a true Sartrean picture. Other people don't get to make claims on us. We owe nothing but authenticity and a lack of bad faith. And as long as we are acting as ourselves with no bad faith, we're good. So there'd be no apology required on that model, but we saw that there are problems with that model. The second model we've seen is this bad, empty 12-step version where responsibility is super easy. All it takes to be responsible is to do whatever you want, say sorry later, and thereby cancel out your need for any other kind of responsibility. And then, more subtly, throughout this season, and the past seasons too, but especially I think throughout this season, we see the slow development of a richer picture of responsibility. A picture of responsibility in which people are situated ineliminably in their contexts and in their relationships to other people who care about them and depend on them, and who they care about and depend on, and who are in various complicated ways conditioned by their own histories and their own patterns and habits of behavior. And yet, even though they don't have Sartrean radical individualist freedom, even though they're constrained in all of these ways and beholden to other people in all of these ways, and genuinely face moral pressures from their connections to others, they still really do need to find a way of taking responsibility within that, where taking responsibility means being willing to be accountable for what you did, for being willing to acknowledge harms that you've done to those to whom you've done them, and being willing to meet your relational responsibilities to other people, recognizing that other people do have ties to you and do make claims on you that matter, and being accountable for your failures to do this. And we see all three of these versions, but that third one is the really full, rich one that doesn't have like a pithy version. You can't reduce it to something quick like we're all radically free, and you can't reduce it to something quick like just say sorry and then you're good, make amends and then you're good. It's a slow process with lots of potential for failure and subtlety built in. Okay, I want to end this lecture by just pointing out something that we see along the way as Bojack goes on his apology bender, which is not to do with this topic of apology specifically, but I think it's worth pointing out. Notice the long story that Anna finally tells him about being underwater. And she says, she almost drowns, and she says, I never again wanted to be weaker than water. She becomes a lifeguard so that she can beat water and be safe from water. And this is a metaphor for her entire life, clearly. Remember, I said in the last lecture when we talked about the underwater world that from now on in the series, being underwater and in water becomes a metaphor for losing your sense of self and your sense of control over yourself and for becoming disoriented. So this is Anna explaining to us how she claimed control over her life, right? How she tried to protect herself from ever again feeling that lack of self-control and that sense of disorientation that comes from being underwater, where underwater is our symbol for being in a fundamentally alien environment in which you don't know the rules and so forth. Her method, which isn't an entirely healthy method of preventing being underwater, preventing herself from losing control again and losing her orientation again, is to prevent herself from forming any kinds of really deep connections to other people. And she actively, and she says this, right? She wants to prevent other people from really knowing her, and she doesn't really want to know other people because she feels like if people really know her or she knows them, then she risks a deep connection. And she also risks a deep connection that might fail, right? They might decide that if they really know her, they're displeased with her or don't respect her or don't love her anymore. So she doesn't want to be at the mercy of other people's needs or their claims on her. And she also doesn't want to be at the mercy of needing their approval and their love. And so her way of trying to strengthen and inure herself from being underwater is just to cut off deep connections so that no one can really make a claim on her as she really is. And she doesn't need anyone else and doesn't make a claim on anyone else and doesn't count on them caring for her as she really is. This is a very Sartrean move, right? This is her finding orientation and sense of control by trying to claim that sort of individualist freedom, which doesn't allow for rich claims from or on other people. So I think that Anna Spanakopita is really the Sartrean character in the show. And that's an interesting feature of her, right? Bojack, we saw in the last episode, or in the last lecture, actively critiques that Sartrean account. And so this is why ultimately he and Anna Spanakopita are not going to be able to have a successful relationship because she can't have relationships that are based on real connections. And I think Sartre would approve. All right, end of this lecture. One more for this season.